June 25, 1876. The temperature in the valley of the Little Bighorn River had climbed past 90 degrees by early afternoon. The grass on the bluffs above the water was the color of old bone. The air carried the particular stillness that the Montana Territory reserved for moments it intended to remember, the kind of stillness that does not feel like peace, but like the held breath before something that cannot be taken back. 263 men rode into that valley. None of them rode out. They were led by a general who had been handed every piece of information necessary to make a different decision, and who had looked at that information, considered it, and set it aside with the serene confidence of a man who had never genuinely entertained the possibility that his judgment could be wrong. Not cautiously wrong, not partially wrong, catastrophically, irreversibly, and finally wrong in a way that would echo through the history of this continent for as long as that history is told. Here is what the history does not say loudly enough. Those men did not have to die in that valley, not one of them. Because the Battle of the Little Bighorn was not fate. It was not the inevitable conclusion of a civilization pressing westward against the people who had lived in its path since before that civilization existed. It was the product of a chain, a specific, traceable, documented chain of decisions made by specific men at specific moments. And every single link in that chain was forged by a human hand that could have chosen not to forge it. Remove any one of those links, anyone, and 263 men come home. This is the story of those links, and of the men who made them. The first link was forged not in Montana, but in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory in the summer of 1874, by the same man who would die at the Little Bighorn 2 years later. The Fort Laramie Treaty of April 29, 1868 was not an ambiguous document. It did not contain language that required interpretation or legal sophistication to understand. It guaranteed the Black Hills to the Lakota people permanently. That word specifically, unconditionally. And it placed the formal signature of the United States government beneath that guarantee as the binding expression of the nation's word. The Black Hills were closed to white settlement. That was not a suggestion. It was a treaty obligation ratified by Congress and published as the law of the land. On July 2, 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led 1,200 soldiers and civilian scientists into those Black Hills on an expedition whose official purpose was to locate a site for a military post. The unofficial pressures behind it, railroad interests seeking a route through the territory, a Grant administration looking for an economic catalyst to address the devastation of the Panic of 1873, territorial boosters who understood exactly what confirmation of mineral wealth in the Black Hills would produce, pointed toward a conclusion that the official purpose provided just enough cover to pursue. On August 2, 1874, Custer sent a dispatch rider at full gallop toward the nearest telegraph station. The dispatch reported gold, not traces, not indications requiring further study. Gold in quantities the expedition's civilian miners described as immediately profitable, lying in the grass roots and creek beds of territory that 6 years of federal treaty obligation had placed permanently beyond the reach of every man who would ride toward it the moment he knew it was there. The dispatch reached the newspapers before the Army had constructed any policy for managing what it contained. The Eastern press published it with the enthusiasm that gold discoveries in remote territories reliably produced in Eastern editors. By the spring of 1875, an estimated 15,000 prospectors had entered the Black Hills in direct violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Men who had read a newspaper, calculated the distance, and made the journey with the practical indifference of people who understood that treaty obligations between the government and indigenous peoples were the kind of obligation that the government renegotiated when renegotiation became more convenient than enforcement. The Army was ordered to remove them. The Army attempted removal, escorting trespassers back across the treaty boundary and watching them return before the escorting soldiers had completed the ride back to their posts. It was enforcement without will, the performance of a legal obligation by an administration that had already privately concluded that the treaty was the problem rather than the men violating it. The Fort Laramie Treaty did not die in a battle. It was quietly suffocated by a government that had signed it, published it, and then watched the economic pressure building against it and made its calculation. If Custer's dispatch is managed differently, suppressed, delayed, released into a policy environment that is prepared a response to it, 15,000 prospectors do not arrive in the spring of 1875. The pressure that produces everything subsequent does not reach the temperature it reached. The chain has no first link, but the dispatch was sent, the newspapers ran it, and the first link held. The second link was forged in Washington in December of 1875, and it was forged with a cynicism so complete that the men constructing it could not have believed the mechanism they were building would be mistaken for anything other than what it was. President Grant's administration, facing the political impossibility of formally abrogating a treaty that Congress had ratified and the practical impossibility of enforcing it against the pressure gold had created, chose a third path. On December 6, 1875, Indian Inspector Irwin Watkins submitted a report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs recommending immediate military action against the non-reservation Lakota and Northern Cheyenne, specifically the followers of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Men who had never signed the 1868 treaty, had never agreed to reservation confinement, and were living precisely as they had always lived in territory that even the Fort Laramie Treaty had acknowledged as theirs. On December 22, 1875, the Bureau of Indian Affairs issued an ultimatum. All non-reservation Lakota and Northern Cheyenne were ordered to report to their designated reservation agencies by January 31, 1876. Failure to comply would result in their classification as hostile. Jurisdiction would pass from the Interior Department to the War Department. The military campaign that produced Little Bighorn would become official government policy. January 31, 1876, 6 weeks, in the middle of a northern plains winter, across distances of 200, 300, 400 miles of country where temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero and the snow lay deep enough to kill horses that were already weakened by months of winter forage. Sitting Bull's camp on the Powder River received the ultimatum in early January, which left his people, in the most generous reading of the available time, approximately 3 weeks to accomplish a winter migration that the most capable military units the Frontier Army fielded would not have attempted voluntarily with full supplies and fresh horses. The deadline was not a deadline, it was a sentence. The decision that those bands would be classified hostile had been made before the first word of the ultimatum was written, and the ultimatum was the administrative mechanism through which that decision would be dressed in the appearance of due process. When January 31st passed and the bands had not reported, could not have reported because the reporting the ultimatum required was a physical impossibility in the time and conditions it specified, the War Department assumed jurisdiction. General Philip Sheridan began planning a 3-column winter campaign against people the government had just officially designated as enemies for failing to accomplish something the government had known they could not accomplish when it set the deadline requiring them to accomplish it. A spring deadline, a deadline that allowed the ground to thaw, the horses to strengthen, the distances to become traversable, changes the calculus entirely. Bands willing to comply are given conditions under which compliance is possible. The justification for military action is at minimum delayed. The second link is not forged, but January 31st was the date they chose, and the second link held. The third link was forged along the Rosebud River on June 17, 1876, 8 days before Little Bighorn, by an act of omission so consequential that its full weight has never been adequately assigned. General George Crook commanded the southern column of General Alfred Terry's three-pronged convergence strategy, a campaign plan built around the simultaneous coordinated pressure of 3 military forces approaching from 3 directions, designed to encircle the village, prevent escape, and force engagement on terms the Army controlled rather than terms the village chose. On June 17th, Crook's column of approximately 1,300 men was struck on the Rosebud by a Lakota and Cheyenne force under Crazy Horse in an engagement that lasted 6 hours and ended with Crook withdrawing south to his supply base on Goose Creek. He remained there for the next 7 weeks. Crook did not inform Terry. Terry, completing his final operational planning aboard the steamboat Far West on the Yellowstone River, was operating on the assumption that Crook's column was where Terry's plan required it to be. To the south, sealing the escape routes the village might use if the northern columns pressed it. Custer rode toward the Little Bighorn on June 25th, believing that the trap had 3 walls. It had 2. The southern wall had been absent for 8 days. If Crook sends a dispatch rider, if the elementary military obligation of informing the commanding general that a major column has been driven from the field is discharged, Terry knows by June 18th that his plan is broken. He waits for Crook. He redesigns his approach. He does not send Custer forward on June 25th into a tactical situation constructed entirely around an assumption that had ceased to be true 8 days earlier. The third link is not forged, but Crook did not send the dispatch, and the third link held. The fourth link, the final link, the one that sealed everything the previous 3 had made possible, was forged on the morning of June 25th, 1876, on a bluff above the Little Bighorn River, in the mind of a single man who had been given more information than he needed to stop and chose, with absolute finality, not to use it. Custer's scouts had found the village trail on June 24th. It was wider and fresher than anything the campaign's intelligence had suggested. A broad, churned corridor of an encampment whose size the trail's dimensions communicated to anyone capable of reading it, which every scout in Custer's column was. Mitch Booyer, the mixed-blood interpreter whose knowledge of that country was without equal in the column, told Custer on the evening of June 24th that the village ahead was the largest concentration of fighting men he had encountered in 30 years on the northern plains. The Crow Scouts, Goes Ahead, White Swan, Hairy Moccasin, Half Yellow Face, communicated the same assessment through Booyer with the directness of men who had spent their lives reading country that was now telling them something they needed the man they were riding for to hear. Bloody Knife, Custer's most trusted Arikara scout, a man who had ridden with him since the Black Hills expedition, a man whose judgment Custer had trusted across years of shared campaigning, looked at the trail on the morning of June 25th and told Custer through signs and through the interpreter that there were enough warriors in that village ahead to keep them fighting for days. Custer thanked him and ordered the advance. He had also received word on that same morning that his column had been observed by Lakota scouts the previous evening. The element of surprise, the tactical foundation on which his entire approach rested, was gone. Gibbon's column, the western wall of Terry's encirclement, was still 24 hours from its designated position. The coordination the plan required did not exist, and could not exist until the following morning at the earliest. Every piece of information available to Custer on June 25, 1876, pointed toward one decision: wait. Wait for Gibbon. Wait for the coordination that the plan had been built around. Wait for the combined force that the signs ahead, the trail, the scouts' assessments, the loss of surprise, the known absence of Crook's southern column, were describing as the minimum requirement for what lay ahead. He had waited for nothing in his military life. He had built his reputation, his public identity, his entire understanding of himself as a soldier on the single quality of riding forward when other men found reasons to pause. It had worked at Gettysburg. It had worked on the Washita in 1868. It had worked across enough engagements that the pattern had calcified into certainty. The certainty that forward was always the answer, that hesitation was always the error, that the village ahead was like every other village he had struck and would yield to the same approach that every other village had yielded to. He divided his regiment into 3 columns. He ordered the advance. He rode down into the valley of the Little Bighorn at midday on June 25, 1876, with the absolute and unexamined confidence of a man meeting his destiny. He was meeting something, but destiny is too clean a word for what the valley contained that afternoon. 263 men. The exact count of the dead has been debated across a century and a half of historical examination and has never been reduced to 0. They died in the grass and in the coulees and on the ridgeline that carries Custer's name today. They died within 2 hours, most of them. Some estimates say less. They died in a defeat so complete and so swift that the first knowledge the nation received of what had occurred came not from military dispatches, but from civilian reports reaching the Eastern press on July 5, 1876, one day after the centennial celebrations had filled the streets of American cities with a confidence about this nation's continental destiny that the Little Bighorn had spent June 25th methodically and permanently qualifying. 4 links, 4 men, 4 moments at which the chain could have been broken. August 2nd, 1874, a dispatch rider carrying a gold report that did not have to be sent in the form it was sent. December 22nd, 1875, an ultimatum with a deadline that did not have to be January, did not have to be winter, did not have to be impossible. June 17th, 1876, a dispatch that did not have to go unsent, that 8 words would have been sufficient to compose, that would have reached Terry in time to change everything that followed. June 25th, 1876. A decision to advance that did not have to be made that morning, against a target whose size every scout in the column had already described, with a precision that the outcome subsequently confirmed was accurate in every particular. 4 links, any one of them broken, and the valley receives nothing on the afternoon of June 25th, 1876. The grass stays still. The river moves in its banks undisturbed. 263 men finish the day alive. The Little Bighorn was not inevitable. It was not the manifest expression of historical forces too large for individual human decision to redirect. It was a choice, made 4 times, across 2 years, by 4 men who had the information and the authority and the opportunity to choose differently. They did not choose differently, and the valley, as valleys always do, received exactly what their choices sent into it. It received it completely, it received it finally, and it has never, in the century and a half since that June afternoon, given any of it back.